Good. Welcome back to everyone to the panel. Here's a nice question to get us worked up, I think. I can see where the questions are. Yes. David Stevenson, I've lost it, sorry. I saw his question earlier on and I now... Yes. Do you think the Paris 1.5 goal is useful or justified? If we can't reach it, are we all going to be blamed for making or getting us to sign up to something that's not achievable? I don't know about you. I'm not expecting to be around in 2050, but that's not the point, I suppose. The question is, are we going to be in any way closer to the target in the next 10 years? Bearing in mind that IPCC has already pointed out that we could actually exceed, at least in 1 year anyway, 1.5 within the next 10 years or so. So, is it justifiable? Is it feasible? That's a general question to whoever feels like taking that on. Pete, let's start with Pete.
So yes, I think it is justifiable. The 1.5 target came from pressure from the small island states in Paris, group of small island states, which will, it's an existential threat for them, the difference between 1.3 and 2 degrees Celsius. And so I think it is justifiable to have a 1.5 degree target. Whether it's achievable or not is debatable. I mean, the mantra for COP26 is keep 1.5 alive. And that means that we can still keep it within reach, even though it requires a Herculean effort of reducing emissions immediately and aggressively, and we're still going in the wrong direction. But we have to have those ambitious targets. If we say we're not going to meet 1.5, so let's now aim at 2 because that's feasible, and then we realise that we're not going to do that because we don't act fast enough. We move it to 3, and then we're just in all sorts of trouble. So I think we have to be ambitious. And the reason the net zero target for 2050 was scientifically back calculated to hit 1.5. So our targets have to be there. National policy is based on those targets, and whether we regard it as achievable or not, we have to have it, I think.
Okay, anybody else want to come in on the feasibility or justifiability of the target? I think it's worth pointing out that the Paris Agreement, the target is actually 2 degrees, but there is a goal of best efforts to get as close to 1.5 as possible, which, as Pete rightly says, came about because of pressure from the small island states and the least developed countries actually as well. I think one of the important things that as scientists perhaps we need to make clear though is that we don't fall off a cliff at 1.5. You know, if we manage to stop temperatures rising above 1.7, say, for example, that would be a pretty good achievement, actually. But Pete's right, the more we lose one, the danger is we lose others. And before we know where we are, we're really pretty well on a business as usual curve. So it's a very tricky balancing act. But I think it's better for people to be aware that as temperatures generally increase, risk increases, and what we're actually aiming for is to reduce risk, and that's the fundamental aim of the whole process, really. Okay, I'm not sure. Somebody, Hugo Talbot has asked, what are your key hopes and concerns for the COP? And if you feel like these are nice general questions. Jan, this sounds like a social science question to me, to some extent anyway.
Really?
Well, it's not physics anyway.
My key hopes are that those many bodies and organisations, which you alluded to, David, in your opening piece, actually have the commitment to make the make the changes that are being talked about endlessly, but are not really happening at any for most of us outside that world, they're not happening at a discernible momentum. If you just look at our food systems at present in Britain, and we have a UK government which is telling us that there is nothing at all to worry about, and yet at the same time we have someone like Pete who's telling us there are good reasons to make some significant material changes. To what extent does that have purchase on action at a body like COP26? And then what are my concerns? My concerns are that the politics will override the real significant risks that we're facing, and that we get people digging in positions which suit their short-term interests in staying afloat, literally in getting votes at the next election or the next election that will affect them wherever they are, and not actually in thinking about the threat to our own livelihoods and our lives, indeed.
Right. Okay, thank you. I mean, I wondered, and this is a more general question for everyone, what the COVID experience actually has taught us. What have we learned from that that has implications for the way we handle the climate challenge? It's maybe something to ponder before you immediately answer that question. And while you're thinking about it, Anthony Seaton has asked, what is the lag between a rise in CO2 and a rise in global temperature? Gabby, that sounds like one for you, really.
What is can you repeat that? What is the lag?
What is the lag between a rise in CO2 and a rise in global temperature? And would a fall in CO2 have a similar lag?
So it's CO2 acts cumulatively. So and also it has a very long lifetime. So and the planet has a significant heat heat capacity. So it takes a while. What the exact lag is depends on how you calculate this. I've done it a few times and came to different answers, but there is a significant lag. So you can't expect every wiggle to see, and definitely you will not see it will be extremely difficult to see a change like the COVID change in temperatures. You see it in emissions and you see it in concentrations a little bit, but not in temperatures to any significant extent. One of the interesting findings that the IPCC had, and that's based on some work done particularly in Hamburg, is that if you look at the difference between the high and the low emission scenario, you can really see that within 20 years or so. So we will see a difference, but it doesn't happen immediately, and that is something that makes it really difficult, and which links to what I was keen on kind of bringing up, and a question and a concern that for me links to Glasgow is that the political system is particularly in democracies is set up for short-term pleasure of, not pleasure is the wrong word, satisfaction of the voters. So if you do, so there is not much reward in making big changes that are immediate at the onset difficult and at the long-term benefit. So it is very tricky to make this happen, and that's my biggest concern, is that everybody gets carried by short-term gain, as I think Jan also said, that it's very tricky to make this happen and work together as a planetary community to do something that is really important. The only way I can see this working is if we work with everybody being very worried about their offspring and their children and the next generation, and also about wanting to preserve the natural world as it is. So it would be really interesting to hear what Janet thinks is the way to overcome this kind of short-termism that's built into politics.
I suspect if I had the answer to that, I'd be very popular. Which would be good, wouldn't it? Short-termism baked into politics. Well, I think it's I suppose one of the things I was trying to draw out there when I was talking is that short-termism is baked more into politics in some democratic structures than in others. And in that sense, I was arguing that the first past the post system in Westminster and the sovereignty of the UK Parliament in the United Kingdom is problematic for overcoming some of that short-termism, because it is set up to encourage what I would call somewhat adversarial. Now, I know there's a lot of collaboration and constructive debate, but also it's set in a rather adversarial context of winner takes all, crudely. So we have a dominant party and a party in power and a party supposedly in opposition. Now, for all the difficulties of a federal republic like that in Germany, and I'm not trying to say that there's any obvious solution in a federal republic either, but it seems to me that there is more opportunity to take a longer term view, and I think that is borne out by the way that there has been a bigger shift in recognizing the political positions of different sectors of society in German politics than there has been so far in UK politics, crudely. For instance, the establishment of the Energiewende in Germany. Now, I know we have climate change acts as well, we have strong legislation, but seems to be, more material capacity to act on those in Germany, notwithstanding coal and the major labour interests and trade unions' concerns with coal in Germany. But on the other hand, we got out of coal in Britain in a big way, not so much because of climate change as because of an opposition to the power of the trade unions, the coal miners particularly. And so we acted rather precipitately and created some terrible disadvantaged communities through that. And of course, that's one of the areas that Scottish Government, given their due, has tried to work on through the Just Transition Commission, through recognising that we cannot have a transition in the oil and gas sector which replicates what happened in the coal sector in Britain. So, yeah, I mean, it's a messy world and a complex world in that sense. And politics of the short term is going to be a factor, I think, come what may.
I mean, my own feeling on this is that governments do actually take a long view as well. I mean, they actually, when you think about it, they do actually aim to either stay in power or come back into power having lost power. So they don't want things that are going to bite them in 10, 20 years' time. And the fact that the UK actually has a target for 2050 is evidence that it has thought about things in the long term. But I agree that short-term issues can sometimes seem to work in the opposite direction from the long-term goal. And that's why I was kind of thinking about the COVID issue, how quickly governments can really act when they have to, and why isn't climate change kind of provoking that kind of very strong action? And I just wonder what people feel about this is why I was asking the question, why do we think that, what can we learn from the COVID experience that might be relevant to the climate change debate?
Could I jump in there just to
yes,
an answer to Anthony Seaton's question about the lag between rise in CO2
right.
and the rise in global temperature, and would a fall in CO2 have a similar lag? I think a fall in CO2 would have a longer lag, and the reason being, when we inject CO2 into the atmosphere, it's going directly into the atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect, if you like. However, once it's in the climate system, a lot of that excess CO2 is being absorbed into the ocean. It goes deep, gets sequestered into the deep ocean, where it can stay for hundreds of years. So switching off CO2 emissions, that CO2 is going to stay in the climate system for potentially hundreds of years. So I would expect the lag to be longer. So yeah, we stop emitting CO2, but the effects of that will be, will be felt over a very long time.
Yes, good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Micheal.
Just to follow up on Neil's response and Gabby's responses to Anthony's question about this lag, one of the interesting key points for me, which came out of the most recent IPCC report, was our current estimates are that when we get to net zero, basically temperatures will stop rising. Now, this has been put forward as a new result, but actually I think we've known this for a while, that actually getting to net zero, we think, is the point where that will cap the temperature rise, which is actually quite interesting related to how the carbon cycle is working. So I think that's an interesting communication tool as well, that our current understanding that's in the latest report is that when we hit that point, that there will be a at that time we expect the temperatures to stop rising, which I think is quite a powerful message that I think it'd be nice to spread that more widely.
Yes, and I suppose as a corollary, that is that once you stop emitting CO2, temperatures stabilize. It's just a question of how long you take to get to that point. And the longer you take, the higher the temperature, basically, which is the other thing that perhaps people don't quite get. So the 2050 and 1.5 are intrinsically combined, I think, intertwined, I should say. Okay, nobody wants to take up the COVID challenge. Well, okay, perhaps we've had enough COVID for a few decades. I haven't seen many other questions as yet. I suppose Hugh's question, what are your key hopes and concerns for the COP, is a good open one. Perhaps, Pete, you want to take up that?
I was going to go on the COVID one, just winging it. The COVID pandemic has been an awful disaster and a tragedy, of course. But the amount of money that we're going to have to spend on the recovery runs into trillions of dollars. That's of the same order of magnitude of what it will cost to completely deal with climate change. So it's presented us with, for the first time, with a tangible look at what the cost of climate change may be. And it's not outside the capacity of nations or economies to deal with. We can deal with it, and we will deal with it. And that's not factoring in the cost of not dealing with climate change, or the cost that will accrue if we don't deal with climate change. So for me, it was of course a terrible tragedy, but the fact that we saw governments switch into a different mode of spending money where it had to be spent on an immediate emergency. And I regard climate change as an emergency. We have legislation, our governments have declared that climate change is an emergency. This is the sort of level of mobilization of resources that we need to tackle climate change, and it's not happening yet.
I've got a question here from Duncan Alexander. How important is it for the Scottish people and the Scottish government to be ensuring their voice is heard during COP26? It's a more political question, I guess. I'm not sitting in Scotland, so I can't tell day by day what's going on, but is there a heightened awareness of the COP and what it means for Glasgow? Pete.
Yeah, we've got a lot of good things going for us, especially in the nature-based area that I spoke about earlier. We've got very large areas of peatlands which could be restored. We've got a relatively small population and a relatively large land area on which to implement these nature-based solutions. So I think we in Scotland can be championing those and showing examples of what could be done to the rest of the world. And the Scottish government, I know, is keen on doing that, because COP is run as a UK government thing, but it's occurring within Scotland. And I think that the Scottish government are keen to showcase that they are serious about climate change, and to showcase a whole bunch of activities that we've got going on that contribute towards climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I would say that it's really important for us as citizens of Scotland to to show what we've got and to show our intent. And that the Citizens Assembly has just completed its earlier this year completed its deliberations and came out with a bunch of recommendations, and all of them were urging the Scottish Government to go further and faster, which I thought was, which gives us the green light to push forward more aggressively with our climate change ambitions.
Okay. Any other comments on that?
We also have a really good opportunity with renewable power. So I think it's also nice to show that it can be done, and that the intermittency and what the intermittency may or may not do. And so it's a really good example. And I think it also connects to the question to what extent the decision making should be strongly connected to the region and to what extent it should be centralized. And I think we've seen that there is a lot of benefit from having some decision making locally and have people hear their voices. I mean, my friends around me are all extremely aware of the COP and are doing all kinds of things and are very disappointed that all I'm doing is science.
Oh, I don't think you should be regretful of that. Do you think we should push education enough in all the issues talked about? That's Jodie Ireland. And do you think more can be done to guide the public and businesses, etc., better in all the issues, and to teach people to be more mindful, for example, when it comes to waste, etc.?
I think that, of course, we could do more, but the young people are the most engaged in climate change issues. It's the older people that we need to educate through lifelong learning that are a bit slow catching up. All the young people that I speak to, all the youth, you look at the climate strikes movement, that's all driven by younger people. I think they want us to act, and they're looking at us and they're feeling, I feel ashamed to be a part of a generation that's not acting for them.
I think there's an interesting example of education for climate change in Glasgow City Council, where they have introduced a basic course for Glasgow politicians, Glasgow councillors, to learn about climate science. And clearly, again, in other research that we've done, we've seen the, I guess, lack of engagement amongst local councils, local politicians, in acting on the climate emergency, even though they may have voted to declare a climate emergency in their council. But then it's easier to vote on a climate emergency than it is then to follow that up by changing the way that the council allocates its funding and resources. And despite my points about our stripped down councils, which struggle to get finance together to do anything beyond their absolute statutory core powers, which are mainly to do with health and social care these days, they do have investment in, they do procure materials, they do procure services and so on, and that investment could all be directed to net zero targets rather than to the least short-term price tag, and that remains a problem. So educating our politicians at local as well as regional and national levels needs to be a priority, as well as educating all of us. We all learn more from the kind of work that we do and the dialogue that takes place around that.
Okay, thank you. Micheal.
Yeah, just to follow up on the education side, I'm teaching here in St Andrews, and there's a huge thirst for education on this from students. I sit in the Earth and Environmental Sciences department. We just teach a small percentage of the students, but from right across the university, there's a huge thirst for learning about these issues: climate science, climate policy, energy policy. And I would say the university is actually really kind of only getting started on fulfilling that desire from students who are not in this department. How does that actually work in terms of the mechanics of the university? But then looking kind of down to the pipeline of students coming into university and colleges, there's also a huge thirst there, and that's almost a more critical and more difficult need to meet. And I think there's lots of discussions going on about how you get climate education into primary, secondary schools, particularly with the erosion of teaching on subjects that are traditionally close to climate science, like geology and geography. How that actually, the nuts and bolts of how that actually is going to happen and embedding in the curriculum, I think, is something that is being talked about right now and is very important, because young people are extremely keen, and we should try and satisfy their thirst for the knowledge.
Yes, I just mentioned that the Royal Met Soc itself has quite a significant education program. Just brought out a book on climate change, actually, which you might be aware of. And we will be, some of us will be at the COP, and our education lead is going to be presenting work on climate change in the green zone, which is the public accessible zone. So there is quite a bit going, but I agree that a lot more could be done on education across both, geography, physics, and maths, and perhaps more widely as well. There's an interesting question from, the trouble is the questions move, so I have to go and find them again. I mean, I can't find the question, but basically, oh yes, it's Patrick Corbett. I mean, to paraphrase, he's pointing out that isn't one of the lessons of COVID is that people are now desperate to get back to doing normal things like jumping on a plane to Italy, as so he said our daughter was. And one of the things I noticed, just something I read, I think today or yesterday, it shows that the emissions that dropped very quickly during the COVID period are now back up to where they were and rising faster. So I think one of the questions that, one of the things that strikes me is that COVID had a big dramatic effect. And yet when you look at the statistics of emissions, it's actually still quite a small blip, and it just underlines the scale of the emission reduction challenge that we face. I wonder if anybody else would like to follow that through and come into that part of the conversation.
There's an interesting, Catherine Hegerl has put this interesting, as that the emission reduction we have done in the COVID years about what we have to do year on year. Which makes you feel quite worried. But on the other hand, I think it is depressing that the emissions are hopping back up again. But I think culture is changing. At least the scientific travel culture is changing for sure. And people are thinking more about carbon, and they can imagine and changes in the way we conduct international business, that this has to be a trip for one day to New York to discuss something. I think we have that I think that's hopefully gone. So I think there are changes, but what we can't attack with COVID is the energy sector, because that was just heating our homes rather than our offices. So this didn't change at all. And of course our food emissions. So we have to bring changes into those quite quickly as well. So I think it is a huge challenge, but it is not, I'm not so pessimistic. And the thing that cheers me up no end is when Susan Solomon has the slide about the Montreal Protocol, which would have done not nearly enough for reducing CFCs. It was just continuous protocols that just beat the curve down over time. And I think we just have to hope that this is what is happening. And I was hoping eventually to ask David where he thinks we are on the COP preparation, and if it makes him more or less optimistic, because I don't really understand what has already happened and should happen. So if I can ask David a question, I would ask him how optimistic he feels compared to where we were half a year ago.
Oh gosh. Well, I think there's a change in tone in people's attitude to climate change. So I think there are still countries which are lagging, and don't show much sign. I mean, significant countries that are not showing much sign of actually contributing to solving the problem. But at the same time, you know, whatever you think about the UK government, at least it's taking a pretty proactive stance, which I would say maybe even 5 years ago would have sounded quite out of place, actually, compared to the general tenor of discussion. So I think the fact that the UK is hosting the COP and is actually pushing strongly to get some results, it's got the diplomatic clout to go and speak to people, which is important. We shall see what comes out of it. So I think there will be progress. You know, one COP is never going to solve all the problems, but I think there's a good chance of significant progress. And the fact that there's a lot of heads of state coming to the meeting is another sign that perhaps people mean business. And already, you know, we've seen signs of movement, maybe not as much as we'd like to see, but some movement from China on coal, having set a net zero target for 2060. You know, this is all positive stuff. We've got the Americans back in. You know, just about a year ago, we didn't have that on the horizon. So I think that I think there's a lot that's positive. But in the nature of these things, you've got to satisfy a lot of very diverse views and countries. And so, you know, things can go wrong, but I think there will be progress made. But the proof of the pudding will be what really happens in the next 5 to 8 years in terms of emissions. And at the moment, we are still not even plateauing on emissions. And that's the critical issue. Somebody asked a question about how much you were involved as scientists with talking to the media. I just wondered whether that was an important part of your activity in terms of, you know, explaining the scientific position to people who actually can speak to a big audience and so on. Micheal.
Yeah, I guess from the climate science side, it's really, I feel like it's really ramped up the last couple of years. I feel like almost every big media outlet now has a dedicated climate correspondent. So invariably for things like the release of the IPCC report or a big heat wave or a big storm, the media requests flood in. You know, I'm sure it's the same for Gabby. And by and large, I've been really happy with how my comments have been presented by the media that I do talk to. And I feel like generally there's a good level of understanding. Occasionally, some media outlets want you to say something particular in a particular angle, but you can kind of spot them after a while, and then you can, you know, avoid them if you wish, or, you know, play it safe. But yeah, no, I think the reporting of particularly climate science has improved a lot recently, and yeah, I think it's great, and I enjoy interacting with the media on these things.
Gabby?
Yeah, I do as well. What pleases me greatly is that we see now a large diversity of scientists on answering questions about climate change. So it's really important to get the young researchers in and to get and to compare when I started my career, I think it was always the same faces you saw. And now we see so many different people working on different angles, emphasizing different things and bringing their own stories. And I think that is very powerful. And so one of the things I'm doing as our director of research here is trying to get our people to also engage with the media, because generally it is a positive experience. You have once or twice you have kind of a strange one, but it's generally a really good experience and definitely worth doing and worth pursuing strongly, and part of my job.
Thank you. Good. Somebody called Mila Costa says an expert reviewer of the IPCC, participated in many meetings, and it's clear that many politicians do not even know what climate is, and they're the ones usually vote against climate agreements. And I think this is something related to work that she did in the States. How do we deal with people who refuse to be, as it were, take it seriously, I suppose. I'm not sure it's much of a problem in this country now, but in parts of the world, it necessarily still is an issue, almost a tribal political issue. I mean, how do we open this up so that people can not see it as a them and us problem, but very much a problem for all of us? I mean, have you had experience of this kind of flat refusal to accept the problem? Pete?
Yes, I don't think that with people like that, people of those opinions, scientific arguments don't cut it. So really, I think that group of people, which are dwindling in number, have largely become irrelevant. So I don't engage very much trying to persuade people who have got non-evidence-based opinions to persuade them to listen and to try and persuade them to my viewpoint or what the evidence says. I let those people continue to believe in what they believe in and just work on the people that want to make a change. Because most people, I think, do want to make a change. The most frequently asked question I get after giving a talk about climate change is, I know Gabby says it's governments must act, and they certainly should. But people ask, what can I do as an individual? How much of a difference does it make if I stop eating meat or eat less meat, or if I fly less, or if I get an electric car? Those are the sort of questions people are interested in. I'd rather engage with those people because we can get positive action than to try and persuade a bunch of dinosaurs who don't believe in the evidence.
Okay, Gabby.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It is still something that I find very difficult to understand why this issue is so polarized. For example, in the United States, where a while ago, and I haven't looked at the not the program, the beliefs of the Republican Party. You can look it up what they stand for, and and what they said about climate change was just flew in the face of science, and it was just, wow, this is a party that is a big party in the United States with a very proud history and lots of very impressive people, and still their party program is basically in complete denial. I hope they have changed meanwhile. So I find it very difficult when this issue gets so polarized, when it seems that you either and then the term comes up, do you believe in climate science, which I think is such a terrible way of, you don't believe in science, you believe in evidence and in rational decision making and in statistics, and it's not a belief system. And if I knew a way to counter the idea that it is a belief system, I would be extremely happy. And I'm looking for guidance from the social scientists again for that one. Otherwise, when I hear something quite outrageous, I follow this where it's coming from and who is putting this forward and what could be behind it. So there's lots of interest that go, and so it's worth looking at. So I had this strange experience of testifying to a subcommittee in Congress at some point, which was quite interesting and also quite depressing. So I haven't found a good solution of how to deal with people who are just not engaging with the scientific argument. I think it would be much better if we could tickle out what the issue is that they are concerned about. If it's often an economic concern, that they worry about their livelihood, or they worry about things they really enjoy doing, such as a close relative of mine who really wants to drive a diesel car and not an electric car. So there's sometimes very strange or things that are dear to people's hearts, and we could maybe, if we can find out what is going on here and why are they where they are, then maybe there's a more rational debate possible.
Well, Jan, perhaps this is something you have a perspective on.
Yeah, I know. I agree with what people have said, in that, the coalition of the willing is the most important place to start, because that will create the main momentum for constructive change in terms of what the climate science is telling us. And we don't have time to try to engage with those who would still argue that the science is not telling us anything significant. I mean, I forget who it was who showed the Donald Trump tweet, but it was Neil or Michael, wasn't it? Who, really can't understand why you get a cold day occasionally when we're being told supposedly that the globe is warming, therefore it means that everything's getting hotter. Well, give me global warming any day kind of attitude. But there is that, I think that the denial aspect, denying the science has been displaced to a large extent by arguing that the price tag is too high. And that's the current, there's a lot of discussion, the discourse of delay, as it's called in some of the discussions. So we can't act now because the price tag is too high. Well, the price tag is too high to save our skins, really? Don't we need to actually prioritize life? And what are we talking about here when we say the price tag is too high and we can't act now? We'll have to wait and see if the price comes down. Well, there's no evidence of quite the reverse. Somehow I find that quite puzzling, how people discount the price of failure to act in a timely and proportionate fashion. It is, I find it deeply.
Well, I think it's just an excuse, really, seems to me. But anyway, Micheal.
Yeah, I think I like the way Jan put it. I think, and I would agree that the outright denialism is finished, right? It's been displaced, and I guess in a sense that's progress. That an argument about the cost is now at least somewhat more rational than denying facts in front of your face. But I mean, I think part of the issue is that there's a sense that people don't. I guess my reading of it through personal interactions is a sense that people don't want to give up things that they enjoy, and also there's a sense that climate change will affect other people. In different parts of the world, and I don't live near the coast and I won't have to deal with it. I think that's part of it as well. There's a sense that I'll be okay. So I think it's a very interesting question how we kind of how people with those opinions can be convinced. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that aspect of like, I'll be fine. I live on a hill somewhere.
Okay, let's pass on to something different. Catherine Hill's asked me 3 times, so I guess she must be really keen to get the answer. What is the reaction to the news of small nuclear reactors being part of the answer to climate change? Small nuclear reactors, so not the big behemoths that we're building at the moment, but a new generation. Is this part of the answer, or is it just the same issue but transferred to a different scale? Does anybody have a view on nuclear? I'm kind of interested to know if anybody's totally against having nuclear as part of the solution to climate change, actually. Everybody's quite happy to accept it as part of the mix.
It's a risk consideration, right? What is the risk
Yeah.
of climate change compared to risk of the nuclear, and also the risk of a coal-fired power plant, which causes huge amounts of health impacts. I think I was really shocked when I heard for the first time what the impact of a coal-fired power plant health really is. Yeah, good question, and I know nothing about small nuclear, but I'm also curious, what is the possibility of doing a lot of small-scale energy supply by local generation as well? So that falls in the same category of doing small-scale local things rather than huge centralized.
Yes, I don't know whether small-scale nuclear can be brought online much quicker than the big plants, but Jan, perhaps you know something about that.
Yeah, I have no idea whether small modular reactors can just be put in my metaphorical back garden or not, but so I'm going to say so much about that as these small actions that can all be taken by absolutely everyone are to do with using less of everything, actually, but certainly using less energy, for instance, in the context of our energy systems. And yet we still don't do that. I'm sure Michael's right that for a lot of, we are very adept at living with contradiction and cognitive dissonance. That's humans. And yet we don't do the things that are staring us in the face, like using less, like insulating. Not sympathetic to the current strategies for Insulate Britain or whatever it's called. the opposition by blocking motorways. But I'm quite puzzled by why, despite 30 odd years of arguing about the need to improve our building standards, we are still building new houses and so on that are not fit for purpose in terms of climate science and what that's telling us. And we'll have to retrofit them in 5 years. It's crazy.
Yes, yes. Well, it's a very conservative industry. That's the first thing I suppose one would say. But building regulations have changed. It's not like they're buildings have to be insulated to a much higher standard now than they were even 20 years ago. But I agree, they're not quite where they need to be. And there's a danger, I think, we get overheated buildings in the summer because we've over-insulated. So,
I was going to make that point, David. I think on the insulation side, the regs have changed, but having lived through summer 2018 in London, it's on the other side. It's on, building buildings that can stay cool without air conditioning is kind of a big issue, particularly in the south of the UK and many other places.
I think that brings to a more general point. I mean, Glasgow, the emphasis is very much on emission reduction, which is right, but adaptation is also part of the mix. And I just wonder whether you feel that the whole policy response on adaptation has been sort of underplayed somewhat. Gabby, you're nodding your head, so you agree.
Yes, because there was a point that was I was also thinking about earlier when we had the discussion, what do we really need to know anymore, how screwed we are, because I think we really do need to know more exactly where and under what conditions we are screwed, because the models at present are really good in telling us that this is a huge problem, and even if climate sensitivity is on the low end, it is still a huge problem, whereas what exactly we need to do to adapt, and we will have to adapt. We never want to see things like the German floods again, where hundreds of people die. And so the information of what needs to be done in adaptation, what will actually come our way in terms of heavy rainfall, and what can help. I mean, I think Pete gave us really good examples also that will also address, for example, flood risk. But we need more information on that, and we need to know what solutions have which side problems or benefits. So I think there's a lot of research still needing to happen in adaptation, and we should not think that investing in adaptation is giving up, because it's not either or. It has to be both.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think you'd agree with that. Neil.
Yeah, I also had some thoughts on this question. So this was a question given to Micheal after his session. Is it worth investing more money in more and more high resolution models of the climate when we basically know the order zero problem and we know the order zero solution, which is stop emitting so much CO2. But yeah, I mean, and my thoughts are, well, the alternative being, should we be investing that time and money into mitigation instead? But those two things aren't mutually exclusive, and if we have really good models of the climate, of the atmosphere and the ocean, then that will help us with our mitigation efforts. So, for instance, Pete gave the example of adding alkaline to the ocean to combat ocean acidity. Now, that's not something that you would just be done willy-nilly. You'd want to know exactly where in the ocean and how much to add. And you would need, and you could do that better with very, very accurate models of the climate. So, it's, in a sense, I do sympathize with the idea, well, why are we doing more climate research when, not enough's being done about the research, the stuff we already know. But actually, the better we understand the climate, the better we can predict it, and the better we can mitigate against it.
And adapt, yeah. Okay. Well, we've actually gone over time looking at my program. So I think I'm going to pull things to a close at this point. Really appreciate all our speakers. Some very interesting talks there. Thank you very much. Covering a wide range of topics, which has really been very interesting and stimulating. Thank you also to our participants in the audience who've thrown lots of interesting questions to our panel and to our speakers. I'm sorry we've not been able to answer all of them, but I'm sure you'll be following the developments up to COP26 and through COP26 with great interest. And well, I hope you all have a way of engaging with the climate issue in your locality and with your families and friends. As Kathy Hayhoe has said, she's brought out a book which suggests that one way to solve the problem is get people to actually talk about it and get the discussion going, and get people thinking about how can we address this issue. So with that, I'm going to say thanks again to everyone, and thanks also to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, working with the Royal Met Soc in producing this conference. So best wishes to you all, and good night.